No sooner had the Bolsheviks come to power than they began to dismantle the financial system, step by step. This was not a sudden chaos. On the contrary, it was an extremely systematic transformation. The first major move came for the banks. In November 1917, the state bank was occupied by Bolshevik forces. Bank managers refused to recognize the new government and stopped money transfers. The Bolsheviks gave a simple answer to this. They seized the vault keys and took the money. In December 1917, private banking activities were completely banned. All private banks were merged with the state bank. That is, in a single day, the shareholders, depositors, and creditors of dozens of banks were wiped out. Then came industry. Factories were first brought under workers' control, then completely nationalized. The owners of large industrial facilities woke up one morning to find they could no longer enter their factories. On paper, they were perhaps still shareholders, but the shares no longer represented anything. The land reform gave peasants the right to seize large estates. Aristocratic families of centuries lost lands they had held for hundreds of years. Some resisted, some tried to negotiate, but the system had now changed. And then came the foreign debts. The Bolshevik government refused to recognize all foreign debts taken on during the Tsarist era and during the provisional government. This was an incredible move. Russia had borrowed enormous sums from international markets over many years. French investors held particularly large amounts of Russian bonds. In an instant, these bonds became worthless paper. French, British, and German investors suffered tremendous losses. Those who sensed the collapse of the system in advance tried to flee. But moving wealth was not as easy as one might think. Carrying cash was theoretically possible, but the value of the ruble was rapidly melting away. Jewelry and valuables were more portable, but searches at border crossings grew increasingly harsh. Bank accounts abroad were theoretically safe, but to access those accounts, one first had to cross the border. Thousands of aristocrats, large landowners, and merchants fled, leaving everything behind. Paris, Berlin, Istanbul, and Shanghai filled with Russian refugees. Most of these people had possessed enormous wealth in Russia, only to begin living in poverty in exile. A former Russian prince was driving a taxi in Paris. A former factory owner was working for minimum wage in Berlin. For those who could not escape, the outcome was even grimmer. People branded as bourgeois became targets beyond merely having their property seized. Being declared a class enemy meant both economic and physical danger. Immediately after the Bolshevik Revolution, Russia was engulfed in a civil war. This war between the Reds and the Whites lasted from 1917 to 1922 and completely destroyed the economy. The government had no revenue. The tax system had collapsed. War expenditures had reached enormous dimensions. The solution was actually simple, but equally devastating. Print money. Russia experienced one of the most devastating periods of hyperinflation in history in 1921 to 1922. Prices changed not day to day, but hour to hour. The money you received in the morning was worth barely half as much by evening. People rushed to spend their wages the moment they received them, because even waiting one day meant serious loss. Saving became meaningless. Signing long-term contracts became impossible. The money economy effectively collapsed and was replaced by barter. This hyperinflation was not just an economic catastrophe. It wiped out the middle strata of society: small savers, pensioners, those living on fixed incomes. The great aristocrat had already fled or had his property taken. The large peasant had taken his land, but everyone in between, small shopkeepers, teachers, doctors, engineers, watched their savings erode away with inflation. The financial destruction of the 1917 revolution shook not just Russia, but the entire world. At that time, Russia was an attractive market for Western investors. The French in particular held large amounts of Russian government bonds, an estimated 15 to 20 billion francs worth. All of these bonds became worthless overnight with the Bolshevik government's debt repudiation. British and American companies had made large industrial investments in Russia. Oil companies, textile factories, mining operations. All of these fell under the scope of nationalization, and foreign owners received no compensation whatsoever. The family of Alfred Nobel, founder of the Nobel Prize, had built a vast oil empire in Russia. The oil operations in Baku were among the largest in the world. The revolution razed this empire to the ground as well. The Rothschild family also suffered serious losses on their Russian investments. The Russian oil investments of Marcus Samuel, one of the founders of Shell, disappeared. These losses left deep marks in the relations between the Soviets and the West for many years. The Soviets' integration into the international financial system was obstructed for decades because of these repudiated debts and compensation claims. The story of 1917 Petrograd shows us how fragile wealth really is. The money in the bank, the stocks in your hand, the title deeds bearing your name, these are all essentially social contracts. They remain valid as long as the state guarantees these contracts, but when the state changes, when it refuses to recognize the contracts, all the wealth you possess is nothing more than scraps of paper. The mistake of the Russian aristocracy was this: they thought the system was unchangeable. They assumed that an order that had persisted for centuries, accumulated wealth, in an established system would continue forever. And they paid a very heavy price for this delusion. This lesson does not belong only to 1917 Russia. Looking at history, similar scenes have played out time and again. In China in 1949, in Cuba in 1959, in Iran in 1979. Each time, some people believed until the very last moment that the system would continue, and each time they were wrong. This is why modern investors take the concept called country risk so seriously. A country's rule of law, its institutions, and its political stability are the true guarantee of the stocks or bonds you hold. No matter how attractive the return figures may be, if the underlying structure is rotten, one day everything can be reset to zero. The people who slept in Petrograd that night woke up to a different world in the morning. They had money, but it was worthless. They had factories, but those no longer belonged to them. They had title deeds, but those were void. Wealth can be reset to zero overnight. The city that taught this truth in its harshest form was Petrograd on that cold October night in history. If this video inspired you and offered you a different perspective, don't forget to subscribe to my channel and give it a like. See you in the next video.